There is a moment, right before something falls apart, where you already know it's going to fall apart. You feel it in your chest before it happens in your life. And most people call that intuition. Carl Jung called it something else. He called it a projection. A picture your own mind painted and then handed to the world, daring it to prove you right. Here's the paradox. The people whose lives seem to keep working out aren't luckier. They're not more talented. They've simply stopped rehearsing the disaster in advance. They act as if it already worked, before there's a single piece of evidence that it will. That's not delusion. That's not positive thinking either. It's a mechanism. And in the next few minutes, you're going to see exactly where it lives in your body. The 1968 study that proved it works on other people without them ever knowing it. And the one question that has to change its answer before it stops running your life. I want to start with something I don't usually admit on this channel. A few years ago, I was sitting on an opportunity I'd wanted for over a decade. Everything lined up, the timing, the people involved, even the small, unlikely coincidences that made it feel inevitable. And I spent the 2 weeks before the final decision quietly building a case for why it wouldn't happen. I checked my phone for bad news I hadn't received yet. I told a friend almost casually over coffee, "I have a feeling this is going to fall through." I said it lightly, like it didn't cost me anything to say. It cost me everything to say it. I wasn't hoping it would fail. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. I was bracing, and bracing, it turns out, is not a neutral, invisible thing happening quietly in the background of a life. Bracing is a posture. It's a stance the body takes. Shoulders slightly forward, breath a little shallower. Attention scanning instead of resting. And the mind follows the body's lead far more often than we're willing to admit. We like to believe thought comes first, and the body just obeys. Most of the time, it's closer to the reverse. It fell through. And for a long time afterward, I told myself that proved my intuition right. I'd known. I wore that knowing like evidence of some deeper wisdom, proof that I understood how the world actually worked, proof that I was the kind of person who saw things clearly before they happened. But that's not what happened, and it took me a long time to be honest about the difference. What happened is closer to what Jung spent his whole career trying to explain. The unconscious doesn't just predict your life from a safe distance, it participates in it. It doesn't watch the story from the sidelines and occasionally get lucky with a prediction. It's one of the authors, uncredited, working the whole time. Here's the uncomfortable version of that idea, and I want to sit with it for a moment instead of rushing past it. Every belief you haven't examined doesn't sit quietly in the back of your mind, patiently waiting to be proven true or false by events entirely outside your control. It leaks. It shapes your posture in a negotiation before you've said a single word. It changes the words you choose in an email, the hedge you add, the apology you didn't need to make, the exclamation point you delete because it suddenly feels naive. It decides half a second before you're consciously aware of deciding anything. Whether you walk into a room like you belong there, or like you're already apologizing in advance for taking up space in it. Jung called the unclaimed, unexamined material of the psyche the shadow, not because it's evil, and this is a distinction worth being careful with, because the word gets misused constantly. He didn't mean a reservoir of secret villainy. He meant everything about you that hasn't been brought into conscious awareness and integrated, the fears you've never named out loud, the hopes you've decided are too embarrassing to admit, the old conclusions about yourself that you formed once, under pressure and never revisited. Shadow material isn't dark because it's evil. It's dark because it's unlit. It's simply unseen. And what stays unlit doesn't disappear. That's the part people get wrong. We tend to assume that ignoring something makes it inert, harmless, filed away. Jung's entire clinical career argued the opposite. What stays unlit gets projected onto outcomes you haven't reached yet, onto other people who suddenly seem to be playing out a script you never handed them, but somehow already know by heart, onto reality itself, which starts to look suspiciously, uncannily like a mirror of whatever you refuse to look at directly in yourself. So the real question was never, does the universe reward positive thinking? That question is too small for what's actually happening, and honestly, it's a little embarrassing to even ask it that way, because it treats the whole thing like a vending machine. Insert optimism, receive outcome. That's not what any of this is. The real question is much stranger and much more personal. What happens to a life when the person living it stops fighting their own unconscious posture long enough to let a different one take its place? I think about that conversation with my friend often, the one where I said, "I have a feeling this is going to fall through because it's such a small, forgettable sentence, the kind you say and forget you ever said within the hour." But it wasn't forgettable to my nervous system. It landed somewhere and it stayed. Saying a fear out loud doesn't release it. The way we like to tell ourselves talking always helps. Sometimes saying it out loud is the final step in making it official, a kind of quiet ceremony where you formally hand your hope over to the thing you're afraid of, and everyone in the room, including you, treats the handover as done. Here's a question worth sitting with, honestly. How many outcomes in your own life have you privately called, in advance, using language that sounded like realism but was actually rehearsal? I probably won't hear back. Knowing my luck, it's probably too good to be true. Each one of those phrases sounds harmless, almost wise, almost protective, the kind of thing a grounded, sensible person says to keep their expectations in check. Say it enough times, in enough small moments across enough years, and you're not describing your life anymore. You're training it, one small sentence at a time, the same way a hand learns a callus, not from a single sharp injury, but from thousands of small, repeated points of friction in exactly the same place. There's a specific kind of person this video is for, and you probably already know if you're one of them. You're not someone who lacks ambition or hope in the abstract. You can picture a good life for someone else in vivid detail without any effort at all. The block is narrower and more specific than a general lack of optimism. It only activates when the good outcome has your own name attached to it. That's not pessimism. That's a very precise, very old piece of self-protection, still running exactly as designed, long after the original threat it was built for has passed. Here's what that actually cost you in practice. Every fear you've never looked at directly still gets a vote in how you live. It just casts that vote from somewhere you can't see it, which makes it impossible to argue with. You can't negotiate with a posture you don't know you're holding. You can only keep confirming it, situation after situation, and calling each confirmation a coincidence. That explains why resistance keeps you stuck. The unlit material keeps steering from below the surface, quietly, patiently, and you keep confirming its script without ever noticing you're the one holding the pen. It doesn't yet explain why acting as if is the thing that unsticks you, and not just any acting. Not performance, not the thin, brittle kind of pretending that collapses the moment something goes even slightly wrong. Something much more specific. Something Jung didn't just theorize from a comfortable academic distance, safely removed from his own life. He practiced it, alone, in a room, on himself, at the exact moment his own life was falling apart around him. In 1913, Carl Jung was, by any clinical definition available at the time, in crisis. He had just broken from Sigmund Freud, his mentor, his intellectual father, the man whose approval had shaped nearly a decade of his professional identity, and the break cost him almost everything that had structured his life up to that point. His professional reputation took a hit he never fully recovered the old version of. Most of his colleagues sided with Freud and quietly stopped returning his letters. His sense of who he was, stripped of the movement he had helped build with his own hands, simply wasn't there anymore. He described the period that followed, in his own later writing, as a confrontation with the unconscious, and by every account from people close to him at the time, it genuinely terrified him. He questioned seriously whether he was losing his mind. Picture the actual scene for a second, because it's easy to flatten a crisis like this into a single sentence in a biography and lose what it actually felt like from the inside. A man in his late 30s, already well known in certain circles, suddenly isolated from nearly everyone who had once shaped his professional world, sitting alone in a room in Zurich, watching strange, vivid images rise up unbidden in his mind. Figures, landscapes, symbols he didn't consciously invent and couldn't fully explain, with absolutely no professional consensus available to him, no established method, no colleague down the hall he trusted enough to call and describe any of it to. He kept a private record of this period, later published in fragments, as what's now known as the Red Book. Years of these encounters, written down and illustrated by his own hand, describing conversations with inner figures who seemed to arrive with their own independent perspectives, sometimes ones that directly contradicted his conscious opinions. Imagine the discipline that actually required. Not the discipline of gritting your teeth through discomfort once, but the far rarer kind, returning day after day for years to a process that offered no external validation whatsoever, that could easily have been dismissed by every single person he respected as the private unraveling of a formerly brilliant mind. Most people in that position do one of two things, and you've probably done at least one of them yourself, in some smaller version. At some point, you'd rather not revisit. They numb it, busy themselves, distract themselves, wait for the feeling to pass on its own. Or they narrate it as a tragedy, tell the story of their own collapse to anyone who'll listen, and wait, half hoping, for the story to end on its own schedule. Jung did neither. Instead, he sat down, deliberately, daily, sometimes for hours at a stretch, and let the images arriving in his mind play out as if they were real. He called it active imagination. He didn't just observe the fantasy from a clinical distance, the way a scientist watches a specimen. He entered it. He spoke out loud sometimes to the figures that appeared to him. He treated the internal world with the exact same seriousness he would have treated a session with an actual patient sitting across from him. He wasn't hallucinating, and he wasn't performing an early version of self-help. He was doing something much stranger and far more disciplined than either of those, acting as if the inner material was consequential, real, worthy of full attention before he had a single shred of proof that it actually was. And what he found, what became the foundation for decades of his later work on individuation, is that the psyche responds to being taken seriously. Material that stays vague, half-acknowledged, glanced at and dismissed remains chaotic, formless, threatening. Material that gets engaged as if it matters consistently over time starts to organize itself into something coherent. This wasn't mysticism to Jung, even though it's often flattened into mysticism by people who've only read the label and not the work. It was closer to a method, rigorous in its own strange way, repeatable, something he taught to patients later in his career. He went on to write extensively about synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that isn't causally connected in any traceable, mechanical way, but that feels connected, weighted, significant. And it's worth being precise here about what he actually claimed, because this is the part people distort the most, usually to sell something. Jung never claimed synchronicity proves the universe is arranging events on your behalf like some kind of cosmic concierge. He never claimed that thinking hard enough about a parking spot produces one. What he claimed is narrower, more careful, and honestly far more interesting once you sit with it, that the psyche and the external world sometimes mirror each other because they aren't as fully separate as our everyday assumptions insist they are. He wasn't offering a physics of manifestation. He was offering a way of paying attention to meaning that the dominant scientific worldview of his time had no vocabulary for. Now let's leave Jung's own life for a moment and ask whether anything closer to a controlled experiment backs up the mechanism itself. Not the mysticism, but the machinery running underneath it, the part that might already be operating on you right now without your permission. In 1968, researchers Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson ran a study in an elementary school that's now famous enough in psychology to have its own name, the Pygmalion effect. Teachers were told, at the very start of the school year, that certain students, chosen entirely at random with no test or evaluation behind the selection, had been identified as intellectual bloomers, children who were about to show a significant leap in ability over the coming months. That label was fabricated from nothing. It described no actual difference between those children and their classmates. By the end of the year, when researchers came back to measure actual academic performance, those randomly labeled students showed significantly greater gains in measured ability than their classmates who hadn't been given the label. Nothing about those children had genuinely changed except one single variable: the expectation held quietly by the adults standing in the room with them day after day for months. The teachers weren't consciously favoring these children. Most of them, when interviewed afterward, said they treated all their students equally and they believed it. What shifted was subtler than favoritism, and in some ways more powerful, because it was invisible even to the person doing it. Slightly more attention in ambiguous moments, a little more patience with a wrong answer before moving on, a tone of voice that assumed competence instead of quietly testing for its absence. The children weren't lied to about anything. They were simply treated consistently and almost imperceptibly as if something was already true about them, well before there was any evidence for it. And the treatment itself became the evidence, manufacturing the very outcome it had only pretended to predict. Notice carefully what that study actually proves, and just as importantly, what it very deliberately doesn't. It doesn't prove that thoughts bend outcomes through some unseen mystical force reaching out into the world. It proves something almost more useful and considerably more grounded, that a quietly held belief changes behavior in ways too small and too automatic to consciously track in the moment, and that those small behavioral shifts compound week after week into a measurably different reality. The teacher wasn't manifesting anything. The teacher was acting as if, and the classroom, the relationship, the whole small ecosystem of that room organized itself gradually around that unspoken posture. It's worth sitting with the design of that study for a moment longer, because the more precisely you understand it, the more unsettling it becomes. Rosenthal and Jacobson didn't just tell teachers a story and walk away. They gave every student in the school an actual intelligence test at the start of the year, a real one with real results. Then, entirely separately from those results, they randomly selected roughly 20% of students and told teachers these were the ones about to bloom. The label had no connection whatsoever to the test scores underneath it. It was, statistically speaking, pure fiction, dressed in the language of measurement, and yet fiction delivered with enough conviction to the person holding the most influence in the room produced real, measurable, retestable results by the end of the year. Let that land fully, because it's easy to hear this as a nice fact about classrooms and miss what it says about you. A belief held consistently by someone with influence over your environment, including yourself, functions as an input your life responds to, regardless of whether the belief started out true. Now hold that finding next to your own life for a second. You are both the teacher and the student in this dynamic, occupying both roles at once in a way none of those school children ever had to. You are the one holding the belief, and you are simultaneously the one whose year, whose decade gets shaped by it. There's no external Rosenthal running the experiment on you from outside, deciding at random who deserves the label of about to bloom. You're the only one in the room with yourself day after day, which means you're also the only one who gets to decide, moment to moment, quietly, which label actually gets handed out, and whether you even notice yourself handing it out at all. It's worth adding one more layer to the Rosenthal findings, because later researchers, replicating and extending the original study, found that the effect wasn't uniform. It was strongest specifically for younger children, and for students who had been performing below average before the study began. In other words, the effect was largest precisely where the gap between old evidence and new expectation was widest. That detail matters more than it might seem to at first. It suggests the mechanism isn't about confirming what was already obviously true. It's most powerful exactly where belief has to do real work, where it has to override an existing track record instead of simply agreeing with one. So here's where Jung, alone in a room in Zurich in 1913, and Rosenthal, running a controlled study in an American classroom in 1968, quietly meet across more than half a century of difference between them. Neither one is describing magic. Both are describing a mechanism where the internal stance, held with enough consistency over enough time, reorganizes the external result, not instantly and not through a single dramatic act of wishing, but by changing everything downstream of the belief: your posture, your available attention, your tolerance for ambiguity, the small risks you're willing to take before anyone has given you permission to take them. That validates the paradox from block one, but it opens something considerably harder to sit with, because act as if sounds on the surface like something you could simply decide to do this afternoon over lunch and be done with by dinner. And if it were that simple, if it were purely a matter of willpower or decision, nobody watching this video right now would still be stuck exactly where they are. So what's actually standing in the way? The specific, mechanical, almost architectural thing operating inside you that makes acting as if feel not just difficult, but genuinely impossible in the moment, even once you fully understand, intellectually, exactly why it works. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because I'm not talking about big, dramatic, once-in-a-decade decisions anymore. I'm talking about Tuesday. I'm talking about the smallest, most forgettable hour of an ordinary week. You send the message and then, almost involuntarily, open the read receipts 3 times in the following hour, watching for a status change that will tell you something about your own worth before you've had a chance to decide that for yourself. You apply for the role and, in the very same breath, mention to a friend that you probably won't get it. Just so it doesn't feel like a big deal when it doesn't happen, you say, as if you're protecting some future version of yourself from disappointment. You feel a flicker of something good starting to take shape in your chest, and your very next automatic thought is a scan for what's about to ruin it, as if good feelings come with an expiration date you're obligated to find in advance. None of that is caution. It feels exactly like caution, wears the same clothes as caution, uses the same vocabulary as caution when you explain it to yourself or to someone else. But real caution protects you from a genuine, external, measurable risk, a bad contract, an unsafe situation, a person who has actually shown you who they are. This protects you from something else entirely, something much smaller and much more private. The raw vulnerability of having wanted something out loud in front of witnesses, including the witness that is your own awareness. That's the mechanism Jung was circling his entire career, from the crisis of 1913 all the way through his final writing decades later. It's not that you don't believe good things happen to people, in general, in the abstract. You watch them happen to other people constantly and don't think twice about it. It's that you don't trust yourself to survive being disappointed by your own hope, so you disappoint yourself first, on your own schedule, in your own controlled and private way, where at least it feels like your decision instead of the world's. It shows up in relationships in a particularly quiet way. You meet someone genuinely promising, and instead of letting the promise be what it is, you start collecting evidence for the eventual ending before the beginning has even finished introducing itself. You notice they took 4 hours to text back and build a small private case around it. You mention to a friend in a tone that sounds like observation but is actually forecasting, "We'll see how long this lasts." You're not being careful. You're pre-grieving something that hasn't even had the chance to disappoint you yet, and in doing so, you're often the one who introduces the very distance you were afraid of finding. Watch closely how this shows up as checking your phone, checking someone's tone of voice for a shift you might have missed, checking the sky, checking a horoscope you don't even believe in, checking again and again in a loop that never actually resolves into certainty, no matter how much information you gather. Every single check is a tiny, almost invisible vote for "I don't actually believe this is already true, and I need external proof before I'm willing to relax." And here's the part that genuinely stings once you see it clearly. The checking doesn't just fail to help you feel better. It actively rehearses the very outcome you're afraid of, over and over, in fine detail. You are, quite literally, practicing disappointment as a skill, getting measurably better at it. Every single day, in small, forgettable repetitions that add up to something enormous over a year, over a decade. Jung would say you're feeding the unlit material instead of the lit one, over and over, until it's the strongest, most well-rehearsed circuit in your entire mind. You're handing your attention, arguably the single most valuable currency a human being actually has, directly to the outcome you fear most. And attention, far more than intention, is what actually organizes a life over time. Intention is what you say you want. Attention is where you actually put your energy minute by minute, and the two are very often in open conflict without you ever noticing the mismatch. Acting as if isn't the absence of checking. It's not some superhuman state where fear simply vanishes and never returns. It's the deliberate, repeated withdrawal of attention from the disaster rehearsal, one small moment at a time. It's sending the message and closing the app, physically, on purpose. It's applying for the thing and telling no one you're scared, because saying it out loud again and again, to friend after friend, is just checking wearing a different outfit. It's still asking someone else to confirm your fear before you're willing to set it down. It's feeling the good thing start to take shape and choosing, deliberately, consciously, in a moment that requires real effort not to scan for its expiration date. Think about how this plays out somewhere even more mundane than a job application or a relationship. Think about how you talk about your own work. Someone compliments something you made, something you wrote, something you built, and watch what happens in the half-second after the compliment lands. "Oh, it's not that good, I rushed it. Thanks, I got lucky with the timing." I deflect it before it can fully arrive, before it can settle anywhere in you and actually change your sense of what you're capable of. That deflection feels like humility. It's usually something closer to preemptive defense. If you dismiss the good thing first, in your own words, on your own terms, no one else's eventual dismissal can catch you off guard. Or think about how this shows up in the way you plan, not the actual planning, the tone underneath it. There's a version of preparing for a big conversation that sounds like, "Here's what I want to say and how I want it to land." And there's a version that sounds like, "Here's what I'll say when they inevitably shut this down." Both look identical from the outside. Both involve sitting down and thinking things through carefully. But one is building towards something. The other is quietly rehearsing its own defeat, dressed up as preparation and calling it being realistic. This is where most people watching a video like this one stop paying close attention, because what I've just described sounds like simple behavior modification. Just stop checking your phone so much, congratulations, roll the credits, thanks for watching. But that's not the layer that actually changes anything durable in a life. Behavior is downstream of something else, something older and more structural. If you only change the behavior, force yourself to stop checking, white-knuckle your way through not asking for reassurance, grit your teeth through the discomfort of not knowing, without addressing what's underneath it, the underlying posture doesn't disappear. It just finds a new channel to leak through, usually a quieter one you haven't learned to notice yet, which is in some ways worse because now it's operating with even less oversight than before. So if changing what you do isn't actually the real lever, the thing that moves everything else, what is? What's actually underneath the checking, underneath the bracing, underneath the entire quiet architecture of self-sabotage that's been running in the background since long before you can remember ever choosing it? This is the part Jung spent the second half of his life trying to fully articulate, and it's the part almost nobody actually gets to because it requires sitting with something, considerably less comfortable than just believe harder or just think more positively. The posture you take toward your future isn't really about the future at all. It's a rehearsal, an almost perfect, note-for-note rehearsal, of the posture you once took toward your past, specifically toward the moments when wanting something openly got you hurt in some way you never fully processed. Somewhere, at some point, hope was unsafe. Maybe you were dismissed for wanting something too visibly, told directly or indirectly that you were being naive. Maybe you watched someone you loved want something desperately, openly, with their whole chest, and lose it anyway. And some younger part of you watching that happen took a private, unspoken vow never to be caught that exposed again. This is the part worth pausing on, because it quietly reframes everything that came before it. That vow doesn't announce itself when it forms. It doesn't sit you down and say in plain language, "I've decided to sabotage your future in order to protect an old wound." It's far quieter and far more effective than that. It just slowly, invisibly rewires what the word safe means to you. Safe stops, meaning protected. Safe starts, meaning braced. And you carry that recalibrated definition into every room you walk into, every opportunity you're offered, every relationship you enter, mistaking it for wisdom, for maturity, for having simply learned from experience the entire time. This is worth being specific about, because it's easy to nod along with the general idea and never actually apply it to a real memory. Think back honestly to the last time you wanted something and said so out loud, clearly without hedging, and it didn't work out. Not the outcome itself, the moment right after. What happened to your face, your posture, your willingness to want something out loud again anytime soon? For a lot of people, that moment isn't dramatic. It's quiet. A slightly too long silence. A well, at least you tried, that landed like a small verdict. Nobody has to yell at you for a vow like this to form. Sometimes the gentlest disappointment does more lasting work than the loudest one, precisely because it never announces itself as an event worth remembering. Jung's individuation process, the lifelong developmental work he considered the actual point of a human life, more important than any single achievement or outcome along the way, is essentially the slow, patient work of finding that old vow of yours and looking directly at it without flinching, without rushing to fix it or explain it away, and without fighting it either, since fighting it only strengthens it by treating it as an enemy worth defeating. The move that actually works is the one Jung modeled on himself in that room with those figures. Meet it the way you'd meet someone real, as if it had something legitimate to say, as if it deserved an actual conversation instead of an immediate dismissal. Here's the mechanism, stated as plainly and directly as I can manage after everything we've covered. Every unexamined fear operates as if it's already true, 24 hours a day, every day, whether you consciously agree with it or not, whether you've ever even looked at it directly. It doesn't ask your permission to run. It doesn't wait for you to consciously endorse it. It just runs continuously in your posture, your tone of voice, your hesitation before speaking, your long-practiced habit of preparing for endings before beginnings have even finished happening. So when someone tells you casually to act as if it already worked out, they are not actually asking you to install some brand new belief into a blank, empty space. They're asking you to displace a belief that's already fully installed, already running with total unquestioned confidence, the deeply held belief that it won't. What acting as if actually asks of you isn't the absence of fear, it's the replacement of one automatic, well-rehearsed posture with a chosen one. It's worth naming what this isn't, because the distortion is so common it's almost the default interpretation. This isn't the instruction to suppress fear, to shove it down and paste a confident expression over it until the feeling exhausts itself. Suppression and displacement are not the same operation, even though they can look identical from the outside for the first few minutes. Suppression keeps the original posture fully intact underneath a performance. The fear is still running the show, just with better manners on the surface. Displacement is slower, less dramatic, and considerably more honest. You don't silence the fear, you simply stop feeding it, the majority share of your attention over and over, until a different posture has had enough repetitions to become the automatic one instead. This is the single hardest sentence in this entire video to actually live day after day, because it means acting as if was never really about optimism, and it was never a shortcut around difficulty. It was always about which unconscious posture gets to run the show by default in every unguarded moment. And defaults by their very nature don't change simply because you understand them intellectually. You can watch this entire video, nod along with every point, and change nothing about your actual life by tomorrow morning. Defaults change because you interrupt them consistently in the small, forgettable moments over and over, until a different posture slowly becomes the one running automatically, without you having to fight for it consciously every single time. Let this settle for a moment, because what comes next is the part that actually changes something in how you move through the rest of your week. This is where synchronicity stops being a purely mystical claim, detached from anything measurable, and becomes something closer to an observable, repeatable pattern in your own attention. When the bracing posture is running the show quietly in the background, you don't notice the opportunities sitting directly adjacent to your fear. Your attention is fully occupied, every available minute of it, scanning for confirmation of the ending you already expect and have already rehearsed 100 times. But when the posture genuinely shifts, when you're actually inhabiting this is already working out, instead of merely performing that sentence for an audience of no one, your attention becomes available again for things it was simply too busy, too consumed to notice before. The open door you'd have walked right past, the reply that doesn't fit your old well-worn story about how these things always go. The version of the conversation where you don't flinch first, and the other person meets you differently because you showed up differently. There's a reason this feels almost supernatural when it happens to you personally, even though the mechanism underneath it is entirely ordinary. When you finally stop bracing against a specific outcome and something good happens shortly after, the timing feels uncanny, almost engineered. But consider what was actually different in the days leading up to it. You returned the email faster, because you weren't dreading the reply. You mentioned the idea out loud to someone casually, in a conversation you would have avoided entirely a month earlier, out of fear of being told it was a bad one. You walked into the room a half-second earlier than you normally would have, because you weren't hanging back at the threshold, waiting for permission that was never going to arrive from outside you. None of that is mystical. All of it is behavioral, small and almost invisible in the moment, and all of it is completely inaccessible to you, while bracing is running the show, because bracing keeps you a half step behind your own life, always double-checking instead of moving. Jung wasn't describing a universe rearranging itself on your behalf around your private wishes. He was describing a you finally capable of perceiving what was already there all along, sitting right in front of you, because the fear had finally stopped occupying every single available channel of your attention. That's the mechanism completed, from crisis in a room in Zurich to a classroom full of children in 1968, to whatever it is you're bracing against right now, this week, in your own ordinary life. Bracing narrows perception down to a single frequency: threat. Acting as if genuinely from the inside, not performed for anyone watching, widens it back out again. Not magic. Attention. Redirected. Deliberately. At scale. Over enough time to matter. I want to stop explaining for a second and just talk to you directly. Because I think you already know where you're bracing. I think you know exactly which area of your life you've quietly stopped hoping for out loud. The relationship you've half-written the ending to already, in your head, before it's even had a real chance. The opportunity you've silently decided isn't really meant for someone like you. The version of yourself you talk about when you talk about it at all, in the past tense, like it's a phase you grew out of instead of a door you're honestly still standing in front of, hand almost on the handle. You are not behind. You are not too late. Whatever quiet, persistent voice keeps telling you that on your worst days. You are not the exception to a mechanism that has worked, in some recognizable form, for every single person who ever managed to stop rehearsing the ending before it had even arrived. Maybe it's the business you keep calling just an idea, so that if it never becomes anything more, you never technically failed at it. Maybe it's the person you've stopped letting yourself think about seriously, because thinking about them seriously means admitting you actually want something with them, and wanting is the part that scares you, not the outcome itself. Maybe it's simply your own future in general, the shape of your life 5 years from now, which you've quietly stopped picturing in any detail at all, because a life you can't picture is a life you can't be disappointed by. You are simply someone who learned a long time ago, usually for a good reason at the time, that bracing felt safer than believing. That was true once. It protected something real and worth protecting. It doesn't have to keep being the only posture available to you for the rest of your life. Back to the moment we opened with, the feeling in your chest, right before something falls apart, that arrives before the actual event does. You now know what that feeling actually is. It's not prophecy, and it never was. It's posture, so deeply practiced over so many years that it starts to feel indistinguishable from premonition. Here's the one-sentence version of everything this video has been trying to say, underneath all the history and all the studies. Acting as if isn't pretending the world is different than it is. It's refusing to keep rehearsing the version of it you're most afraid of one more time out of sheer habit. And here's the layer I didn't tell you at the very start, because you weren't ready to hear it yet, and it would have sounded like a contradiction of everything that followed. This was never actually about your reality always working out, in the literal sense of that phrase. Some things don't work out. That was never the promise underneath any of this, and anyone selling you that exact promise, that guarantee, is selling you something considerably smaller than the truth. The actual shift, the one that matters, is this. A person who has genuinely stopped bracing can meet whatever actually comes, including the outcomes that don't go their way, including real loss, without having spent the entire waiting period beforehand quietly destroying their own nervous system in advance, for nothing, over an outcome that hadn't even happened yet. That's what Jung was really after, underneath the theory and the case studies and the decades of writing. Not a life free of loss, because no such life exists for anyone. A life free of pre-loss, a life lived once all the way through instead of lived twice, once in dread, alone, in advance, and then again for real, whatever the outcome turns out to be. Think about what actually changes if you carry only this much forward from everything we've covered. The next time you feel that flicker of something good starting, you notice the scan beginning, the automatic reach for the thing that might ruin it. And instead of following it, you simply let the flicker stay unguarded for a few seconds longer than usual. That's it. That's the whole practice, in its smallest possible form. Not a total personality transplant. Not permanent fearlessness. Just a few extra seconds repeated, of letting a good thing exist without immediately building a case against it. So, if you've been resisting quietly, in ways so small and so habitual, you almost didn't notice you were doing it at all. This is where that ends, starting now in this exact moment. Not because the universe suddenly owes you anything for having listened this far, because you finally stopped rehearsing the ending long enough to let a different one in. You were never behind. You were bracing. If this video put language to something you've been quietly carrying without the words for it, that's exactly what this channel exists to do week after week. Subscribing isn't a favor to me. It's a small private agreement with the version of yourself that's finally done rehearsing the worst-case scenario before it's even happened. That's who this channel is built for. If you want to go deeper into this work at your own pace, my book, The Quiet Force, is pinned in the comments below. It picks up exactly where this video leaves off. Comment, "I choose trust." Tomorrow, we're going somewhere even stranger. The exact frequency Jung never lived to name but might have recognized instantly if he had. I'll see you there.